Okay, another thing that keeps coming up is how to find the inverse of these more complicated equations like this. So most of you remember that the inverse can be found by simply switching around the x and y. So instead of, in this case, y equals 5 times the square root of x minus 3 plus 7, it would be x equals 5 times the square root of y minus 3 plus 7. So everything would stay the same except for the x and y get switched around. Now a lot of people, and then you're supposed to solve for y, which is where things kind of fall apart for some people. Let's put that back, because some people just aren't really sure how to solve for y there. So one thing that I suggest, if you're not sure about the order of things, pretend like I gave you a value for x. Like pretend I told you x equals 10 or something like that, and see what you would normally do. And make a list. So the first thing you would normally do if I said, and you did not know what the inverse was, so you were just working with y equals 5 times square root of x minus 3 plus 7, you would say, well, I would subtract 3 first, because if I knew x was 10, I'd use order of operations and do what's in those parentheses and subtract 3. And then the next thing I would do after I subtract 3 in there is I would take the square root, because I'd have a number and I'd be able to take the square root. And then I'd multiply by 5. And, and then I would add 7. And then I'd be done with the problem. So list that out, what you would normally do, exactly the order that you would do it in. Then what you're going to do to find the inverse is you're going to go exactly the opposite. So you're going to go backwards and do the opposite. So start with x. So I have x. And then instead of adding 7, so I'm going, now I'm going to go backwards, and I'm going to do the opposite. So I'm starting with x, and now instead of adding 7, I'm going to subtract 7. So now I have x minus 7. And I'm going to recognize that that's a quantity. And then instead of multiplying by 5, I'm going to do the opposite, divide by 5. Alright, so now I subtracted 7, divided by 5. Square root, the opposite of that is to square. So now I'm going to take this whole thing here, and I'm going to square it. Alright, and now, so I subtracted 7, divided by 5, squared it, and now I'm going to add 3. Last step, add 3. Now I'm just going to stick a y equals there, and I'm done. Now if you had started with swapping the x and y like we did over here, notice how you would normally subtract 7. And so now I have x minus 7 equals all that stuff. And then after you subtracted 7, let's see if I can, no I can't. So now you have x minus 7 equals 5 times the square root of y minus 3. Okay, and then you would go ahead and divide by 5 to get rid of that 5 that's there. So you would divide by 5 to get rid of the 5. And then you would square both sides to get rid of the square root. And then you would add 3. And either way, you would still get this exact answer. So that's two ways of doing it. But when they're complicated like that, you might want to list it out. It's a sure thing. Good luck.